also did a very different project, which was called Fizzies, which was, and it was again a proof of concept, which was basically about children learning to nurture a digital pet through their own physical activity. So they would wear very much like a watch, or a Tamagotchi, if people are familiar with the Tamagotchi games, that was connected to various heart monitors, and would actually tell how much exercise the children was doing, and then the little avatar, the little character on their watch would change. You know, if they hadn't done much exercise, it would have a grumpy face, and it would smile if you'd done the amount of exercise that was recommended. So we were looking at the interplay, the digital technologies, learning and human activity as well. We also did other projects that were around using digital media and mobiles and locative technologies that interlinked and knew where you were with a GPS recognition system. And some of that was very focused on developing a virtual overlay onto a real landscape. And a lot of it was very subject specific, some of it was around kind of guided tours, but some of it was very playful as well. How one of the projects that developing Mediascapes works is basically you have a piece of software that gives you a map on the computer screen. Into that map you can drop regions, and into those regions you can drop video material, audio material, still images and so forth. So you can take a map of this area, for instance, and on your computer screen you could drop the regions in with all your digital content. When you download that to your mobile device and walk out into the real location, the GPS knows where you are and it delivers that content to the handheld device. So again, that was the sort of project that got us to challenge where learning might take place, what sort of learning happens, but also how you learn, who you learn with, but also thinking about how you create content and knowledge in the outdoor space. You know, so thinking beyond the classroom walls, how we can construct and develop knowledge. As I say, I haven't got time to go on too much about former prototype projects, but just to give you a bit more background, prior to FutureLab, I worked at Vector, which is a British educational communications technology agency, which was the central government organisation for promoting new technologies in education. I was head of evidence and research there latterly. And obviously we dealt with a lot of national projects, big projects, research projects. The Impact 2 studies, if people are familiar with the Impact 2 study, and also the TestBed project, which was a big saturation of different types of technology in schools. And there's some interesting anecdotes I could give you there. I'll save them for now, but if anybody's interested in those, we can chat later. Prior to that, just give you a bit of personal background. I did my PhD at the University of Bristol, where strangely today I've seen Ernesto again, who was studying at the same time as me, which is a wonderful surprise. It was around the sociology of education and technology, looking at inequalities and so forth. Anyway, that's enough background. Just very briefly, and I'll whiz through some of these. This project is emerging. We're thinking about the different types of game and gameplay and how we might evaluate that and how we might look at the process. But in terms of what is a computer game, they're so varied. They're varied in terms of the level, the focus, the age appropriateness, sometimes the subject specificity, and also they're varied in terms of the types of games you play, but also the platforms that you can use. So we had a lot of initial conversations about which sort of games might be appropriate for the project. We kind of are going towards sort of off-the-shelf computer games, but you know the actual specific details still to be decided. But what that means in terms of the research evidence is that it's actually very hard to say comprehensively that games have X impact or Y impact. A lot of it depends on how they're played, obviously. A lot of it depends on the speed of the changes in the games and the technology. It's pretty hard to compare like for like. I'll go on to projects later where we use 3 different games that we use in very, very different ways. So we have to think about how we capture that diversity when we develop our methodologies. Increasingly, games are getting more and more elements of user control, users being able to design elements of the game, whether it's a character, whether it's the way they navigate the game, whether it's the way they can actually, in some cases, program and change the game. There's a lot of stuff happening out there online and elsewhere where a lot of people are actually adapting existing games and making a new game out of it. So the reconfiguration of games is something that's coming to the fore. Increasingly, there are a lot of games that are networked either online or networked through communities of practice or interest, and also in terms of being able to collaborate with other people. You know, you can do it on a simple level if you're sat around a console with your friend, but also you can link across schools, also you can link across geographical boundaries and so forth. Although I would say there's a really interesting issue here. We still look to define a game as a single unit, and it's very, very tricky. And again, this is something we need to think about in the methodology. However, I would argue that increasingly, I mean, take the boom in applications, for instance, you're getting elements of what we might think of as gameplay within a lot of digital resources. Simply, you know, you might have had a flat resource from a book, say, that was then digitised but still didn't go anywhere. But increasingly you're getting different ways to navigate and understand, and even work with other people, and even set your own boundaries around how you interact with that game. So there are elements of gameplay within a lot of things coming through, so it's very hard to distinguish what's a game and what isn't. So in the research, and when we talk to the teachers, we have to talk to them about which elements they think are playful and where does it overlap with the actual subject learning, the skills development, and so forth. I think it's worth just saying before I start to talk a little bit more about the research, the context of this. Particularly in the UK, we've recently had a report that informed the UK government about their direction of educational technology policy. And it was a report that focused on all areas of technology in education and looked at how it related to the wider world of economics and business, and also where the developing trends might be going. And it particularly highlighted the games industry as one being, you know, kind of lacking in innovative graduates and so forth. So that report was taken on, and we heard on Wednesday a change in direction in terms of the policy, where we're removing the ICT GCSE curriculum now because it was seen as outdated, too slow. We're looking at kind of introducing elements of computer science, but also the government was, you know, giving out clear signals that we need to think about various different ways that technology can be used in the classroom, rather than as an add-on. You know, we were talking, or Mr. Goh was talking about making learning with technology much more interactive, much more fun, much more engaging, and actually people having more control about how that's assessed, and also how it's delivered, and what elements you look at. In a broader sense, there are some big socio-technical trends going on. The first one might be around the information landscape. The digital information landscape we have is getting more complex, getting more rich. Arguably it's getting harder to manage, getting harder to understand, but you can begin to see different technologies coming through that are allowing people to understand that information, gather it and store it in different ways so that they can make their own personalised trajectories through that landscape. You're getting push and pull technologies that not only allow people like myself to be able to speak to people in different countries and along a whole range of different issues and through different media, but you're also getting those that kind of suck in content from trusted sources as well. Twitter being a very old-fashioned, in a way, example. You know, you're getting all these feeds from your Twitter circles, but you're then getting more sophisticated technology that allow you to define your interests, and it sucks it all from cyberspace, from blogs, wikis, online resources, websites, and so forth. So you get it in your own little personalised view. You're also getting more socio-technical developments in terms of the ability to collaborate, interact with other people, to publish, share, edit, store, gather, re-edit, and actually publish materials all over. That kind of social aspect of digital technologies is getting stronger and stronger. But with that, there are also institutional boundaries that are breaking down. Traditionally, we had certain institutions would own knowledge and guard it very defensively. But now we're getting organisations and countries sharing their knowledge more quickly, more easily, more openly, and also, there is a kind of disposition emerging in cyberspace, shall we say, where people are kind of getting used to that. If I produce something now, I do everything I can to make it freely available for people to rehash, comment on, share it with other people. Those boundaries are going. Likewise, the technology is also allowing us to rethink geographical boundaries and also what we do in different spaces. In one sense, geography has become more important because you can label things in the ether, in the virtual landscape. You can create rich textual pictures in the outdoors and information that allow you to navigate a city by the information that's left by other people. On the other hand, geography is also more and more important because you have to understand your sense in the world, your space in the world, and also be able to understand the critical literacies that allow you to talk to other people in that sense. There are a couple of other interesting changes as well. One is that we often talk about digital natives. It's a term I'm not too fond of, partly because it seems to generalise. And what happens to the digital natives when they grow up? What happens to the digital natives when a new technology comes on? There are so many different apps and diversification around technology that we have to think more in a more detailed way about how these really happen, how they really affect. And there is that kind of easy sort of polarisation that a lot of people use to describe. And as we know, there are a lot of people in this room who are very good with technology, and there are also those of us who probably aren't as good with technology. All these sorts of changes should really make us think about how we're educated today, what it means to be educated today, are the whole set of different skills that we need. Not just in terms of our ability to use the technology, but to understand the critical literacies that allow us to apply it, allow us to explore the different narratives that are developed and embedded in the technologies. It also should make us think about a whole set of different 21st century learning skills. What does it mean to actually look at the technologies to help us reflect, create new ways of thinking, develop problem-solving strategies and so forth. These are the sort of things that we need to be quite explicit about in the project and get the teachers thinking about from the outset. What are those 21st century skills and how are they going to use the games to actually stimulate those and help them develop it? And also not just see games as the games as a magic bullet or a one-off. It's not an elixir. It won't solve everything on its own. It should be seen as a part of a suite of different resources, not all digital, that help teachers think about the different skills that they need to help learners develop. Kind of going on to the research now. A few years ago at Future Lab, we were involved with a project called Teaching with Games, which was largely funded by EA, big commercial games provider, and it was looking specifically at commercial off-the-shelf computer games and their application to education. We didn't know what was going to happen, so we had quite a different methodology to the one we will develop here. It was a kind of like throw them in, talk to the teacher, see what happens sort of approach. It was a one-year study. It's a first of its kind and scale. Whilst I don't want to take too much time to look at the specifics of this study, it is worth kind of stating almost the obvious that we had 10 case studies within 4 schools. We had 3 games, which were Knights of Honor, The Sims 2, and Roller Coaster Tycoon, which are kind of a lot of them are platform games, a lot of ways different reconfiguration. So they were used in different ways in the classroom. Things like Roller Coaster Tycoon is a game where you build your own roller coaster. So therefore, the kind of scientific principles behind developing the roller coaster and how you get the thing to work and go up and down, were taken and deconstructed from the game narrative, which is a set narrative developed by the game makers, and actually reconstructed through the teachers, the educators, to kind of almost kind of scaffold and show and demonstrate, simulate in a way, some of those principles that they've been talking about in the classroom. Of course, there were a lot of other examples that I can't run through now, but some of the case studies, we didn't see the games being used that closely to the curriculum goals and aims. Some of them were kind of just played almost because we're in a project and they're interesting and the kids are quiet, let's be honest. But some of them were really focused on the skills and knowledge and thought about the different media and narratives within the game and how they could enhance the skills and abilities they were trying to foster. There were a lot of learning came out of this in terms of some of the logistical issues, which thankfully we'll be able to hopefully head off at the pass by choosing the right games, thinking about things like copyright, talking about things like actually structuring, timetabling your lessons. Some of the games take a bit of time to set up, and then you've got to actually explain what they do. You might have to extend the teaching times and so forth. So all these kind of logistical and practical things. Quite as you'd expect, really. Probably the key finding, the most interesting finding, was that when things worked best, it was about the teacher's pedagogical understanding, and this varied significantly from case to case. But when the teachers understood first and foremost what their pedagogical aims were, they were able to sort of look at the game, evaluate it, deconstruct it, and use it in an appropriate way. Sometimes it meant long periods of gameplay, sometimes it meant very short, specific pieces. But actually it was about how they saw it in a way. It's just another resource, in the same as you might do as a bit of paper. But then understanding the dynamism within it, the different sort of media they use, the things that kind of appeal to different sort of learning needs and learning styles and so forth. So, looking at the kind of broader research and theoretical perspectives out there, there are loads more, and I apologise for just kind of dashing through these relatively quickly. Why are people saying that potentially off-the-shelf computer games are great learning resources, shall we say, learning tools? Well, obviously they're media rich. If you think of some of the best games, or perhaps the most commercial and funded games, if you think of the different media that goes in there, you have graphic design of excellent quality, you have the music there, people create scores for games now, not just films, but musical scores for games. You have the graphics design, you have the actual programming that goes behind it, you have a lot of engaging content for users. It's dynamic, it's high speed, it comes in quick, you can get up there and try again, so it keeps a lot of the users, let's not call them learners for now, but the users really engaged with what's going on. Some people obviously say that it's kind of distracting, it takes people off task, but actually if you think about the dynamism and the speed, that is, dealing with that sort of information is the skill in itself. I think Paul Howard-Jones will probably say something about processing skills and cognitive development later this afternoon. It provides instant feedback. Now, if we think about it in terms of, sorry for generalising horribly, but if we think about it in terms of how gameplay, if you think of gameplay as almost an inbuilt pedagogy or approach, how that might change from some more didactic approaches to teaching learning without such materials. It actually provides instant feedback, whether it's through point scoring, whether it's through your character not doing so well, some of the shoot 'em up games obviously dying. Also how maybe in Sims you might build your city so you get something visual, or you sometimes get feedback from different characters. Increasingly you can get feedback from your co-players. How instant is the feedback that we see in most teaching and learning experiences? It's not as rapid, it's not as quick, and it's one of the key issues that when I've done a lot of sort of case studies, when you ask children about kind of what are some of the things you'd like to see in education, we want more feedback on our work and we want it quicker, because by the time we get it, we've moved on to something else and we forget it. So potentially that kind of feedback loop is something that can be really powerful if it's kind of framed within a broader pedagogical model. They're also flexible and customizable. Learners feel more of a sense of ownership. They feel more of a sense of engagement with them if they can customize elements, develop elements themselves, change the characters, change the way they navigate it, decide which platforms they go in, which levels they go in. And of course, lots of collaboration and cooperation goes on in the playing of the games, particularly the ones that are linked online, or the ones that are seen as kind of group games as well. I think where it gets important, people like James Gee talk about why we can learn from computer games in terms of how we might structure a great learning experience. And this kind of relates to some of the structural barriers that probably some of the teachers will overcome, and the contextual factors, is that as opposed to kind of high-pressure, intensive examination system where you have to learn the curriculum to pass a certain test that happens at a certain time, there's a lot of pressure in there to do well, and children often get very stressed by it, and you end up focusing on a very narrow range of potential learning. What James Gee is saying is that these things are high engagement because of all that digital richness that's around there, but also because you can go in and if your character doesn't do so well, you can get back and have another go. If you kind of got to a certain point, you can try another level. These things are kind of, there's no kind of punishment within the computer game design, like there is perceived to be sometimes in education if you don't pass. You go back to the start and you'll be behind everybody else. It's playful, it's kind of fun, but also in terms of thinking about assessment, has elements of what might be saying ipsative assessment play. That is that you're not competing with everybody else in one sense necessarily, but you're also competing with yourself, to get that little bit better, to go on to another level, to try something different. So there's that kind of internal competition with yourself that's built into the gameplay. I think increasingly there's something that we might describe as internal differentiation. So the computer game kind of knows how good you are, and a lot of them can remember. You can save your games, you can save your play and go back another time. So it allows that sort of differentiation. A lot of, we could all play the same game now, we could all be at different levels, different stages and so forth. That's very different to often how we operate in classrooms. Everybody has to go through at the same pace, everybody has to achieve the same, understand the same knowledge, achieve the same exam. So it's that kind of differentiation that's available. And also the self-discovery, the regulation of how you play it belongs largely to the individuals. If you choose to play it, you can also decide where you start, who you play with, so forth. So there's a degree of ownership that goes with it. Now, if we move to the reported benefits, and I'll come to this in a slide or so, we've got some real problems in terms of looking at the actual research evidence, because it's so diverse. It's often not comparable. But of course, you will see in a lot of reports, and a lot of reports come from different types of literature. You'll get your academic literature, you'll get kind of things that may be government supported, you'll also get the kind of promotional stuff. But most of them, across the board, will say you get engagement and motivation and stimulation of the children. Unsurprising. Although, you would have to ask, what happens if we brought a totally different result? Would the effect be the same? If the study is within a wider project and there's more attention on it, would people be motivated and engaged as well? Perhaps when you start to get down to a more meaningful level, because motivation and engagement, etc., is important in itself, because it can lead to other learning opportunities, it can change children's disposition towards learning and so forth. But maybe we need to think about mapping out the involvement, the engagement, the collaboration, the communication, and where that happens. And a lot of the research doesn't do that very well. It mentions it, but it often doesn't give us the kind of rich picture of how it happened and why it happened. It might have been through an individual teacher who happened to be, kind of somebody who's very passionate or brilliant. or it might be from somebody like Derek, who kind of gets people inspired. Because then you have to think about the sustainability of it, if that is the case. How do you kind of make sure that continues and has some legs and transfers to other people? We see things like co-constructed learning. A lot of the research reports focus on how, because it's part of young people's, I guess, cultural language and cultural experience, far more than it often is. This is a big generalisation, but far more than it often is with adults. So when things like this are brought into the education, the formal education arena, there's often a shift of relationship between learner and teacher. And we see often young people offering information, advice. They also share it with each other in a much more, there seems to be less of a cultural baggage with it, to share some information about games than you might do about one of your more formal subjects. You also get kind of, not just a skills exchange where you get tips around people, how do you use the functionality, but also kind of knowledge exchange. So, we've lots of reports of children saying, but we could also do this, we can look at this different game. So the knowledge moves on. And I think what we would argue, probably from a more theoretical perspective, what we're seeing are changes towards schools actually really drawing on the funds of knowledge that are available. So funds of knowledge is a term that was coined by Louis Moll, who was a researcher, and he was looking at failing children, and he developed a totally different curriculum that was based on, first of all, children's interests, but therefore, there again, where the knowledge was in their local community, to develop a new curriculum that was meaningful, was relevant to them. So the potential of that co-constructed knowledge moving us into a different pedagogy is coming through in a lot of research. Obviously you have the kind of visual, spatial and cognitive processing that happens and develops, and I think Paul will kind of talk more about this afternoon. And you also get the functional technical skills, not just understanding the game, but also understanding the narrative of the game. So people then start to move to probably something more around the critical digital literacy. So why was a game constructed? How is it constructed? Where might the power interest be? Who actually designed it? Is it about making money? But you also get there's evidence in the research literature of children then starting their own critical research projects to look at digital media, particularly games. The ability to kind of step back, think, reflect, come up with a strategic plan, create new challenges, solve problems. They all come through in the literature as well. It's so varied in so many different types of games that it's hard to make a generalisation, but they're there in the literature. And actually, gameplay actually forces us to make decisions pretty quickly sometimes. But also the games that allow us to reflect, to actually think about how we approach material. As I mentioned with the Teaching with Games project, they can help us with our conceptual understanding. We can be, there are simulation elements, there are kind of modelling elements. There is actually some scaffolding, to use an educational term, within some of the games that can help young people learn new concepts and ideas, and also test hypotheses. We're then talking about some of the games that are applied specifically to a subject area or a skill area, and we've seen some marked improvements in those. And I think Derek might mention some of the projects where we're talking about games being used for specific subject learning or skills learning, and you've seen moves in attainment and test scores. There are a lot of challenges with that because it all happens within a broader context, but you get the feeling. And then there is this development of wider technological dispositions. This is something that's very grey, very hard to define, but often in the research we hear students and teachers thinking, from my experience with the gameplay, it's made me think about different technologies and actually developing my suite of tools to help the learning. That's dependent on their pedagogical understanding, but it does sort of change attitudes, change approaches, and it can create new opportunities as a result. But It's a big but, if you'll pardon the expression. The issue is that with a lot of technologies, they can suffer from techno-romance. You know, we like the shiny, we like the new, we like it, and it depends who's reporting it as well, because some of these reports become almost our common knowledge, and we take them for granted, and there's assumptions made. There are a lot of reports out there that have been influenced by the people who sponsor them, in terms of the results that come out, and then they're refracted again through media, through different people blogging about it, mail itself. Interest, we have the fanboys around you who will say, yes, it's great, this is great, without really thinking critically about what it has done. And I think the games literature in general has suffered from that, but partly because a lot of that research is not always well reported. Kind of reporting the research requires funding, so sometimes it doesn't happen well. And actually, a lot of the people who are doing great stuff with games are funded to do great stuff with games. They're not necessarily funded to report it in a very academic way, necessarily, or don't have the time to. You know, it's a real frustration for them. Some of the best use of digital technologies happens in informal areas, happens in the creative areas, but somehow it doesn't get written up in terms of pedagogy, in terms of skills development, and so forth. So a lot of that knowledge kind of dissipates. And there are great people out there blogging about it and so forth, but sometimes it doesn't come through in the literature. Obviously we get the stuff that is, you know, heartily promotional. You know, if you've got a vested interest in games companies looking to get into the market, then you will get kind of influence on what is reported. Many of the studies that I've alluded to begin and end with motivation and engagement, and say little else. They might say something about the technical mastery of the game, and then make overgeneralizations. Unfortunately, there's a lot of one-off studies. I mean, even our Teaching of the Games project, which was quite unique at the time, going back 5 years, it was a kind of one-off. Once it finished, you know, there was no funding there to do anything else. There was nobody able to track specifically and clearly what the teachers did next, what the children did next. They're often kind of sponsored, so that, you know, the project is about the game use rather than kind of thinking about the broader educational frames. Importantly, there's often no sustainability of the projects, and this is, I think, where the project as a whole needs to start to think more broadly and work with all the partners. This is just one element that could lead to something. It could be a catalyst in itself to think about digital technologies and skills more broadly. Things often end, people don't like materials to transfer. There has been a lot of good practice material, but actually in terms of games, because it's so diverse, people think often it's not worth the effort, because, you know, how can we say what's going to happen in a year's time? This information might be redundant. But that's because it's not couched in the broader skills, knowledge, thinking about how the game's constructed, and so on. So we've kind of got a problem. Well, we've also got a problem because a lot of and this applies to all sorts of digital technology and education. There's so much goes on in the school, as you're all aware. There's so many kind of potential variables that could alter what happens. Change by it could be an individual, it could be a teacher off for illness, it could be a particular bright student, it could be, you know, somebody coming in from an educational field, or it could be somebody from a commercial company. All those things can influence actually what happens, but there are often desire to make clear causal relationships between technologies or gameplay and test results are normally kind of the ones people want to kind of talk about. And it's incredibly difficult. There are ways of isolating those variables and looking at impacts, but actually to do it justice, you need to set it within the wider context, because it is that context that tells you about why it works or why it doesn't, and how it works and how it doesn't. There is also a kind of Hawthorne effect that goes on with a lot of technology studies. Without mentioning specifics, I can think of huge government-funded projects that talked about technology to schools, and from the research, despite all the efforts of the researchers to kind of qualify, that then was taken, published, taken by the media, and suddenly, box X equals so many grades improvement on your SAT scores. It was far more complex than that. So we should not necessarily look at those specific detailed improvements, because we might be fooling ourselves and probably misleading other people. So we need to kind of get behind that and think about what is really going on. So this kind of positivist or pseudo-scientific approach might not necessarily be the best way to address a project such as this. There are so many different schools, so many different people, so many different policies, so many different contexts. We have to think about a methodology that addresses that complexity in better ways. And unlike the Teaching with Games project, I think, and these are just my feelings for now, if you see Bob sort of going green and sort of shaking his head, you realise I'm way off the mark. But actually what we need to do is think about also how we start to scaffold the teachers' thinking about what skills they're developing, also what's gone before, kind of give them lots of sort of stimulus information, get them to start working together clearly so that you have those sort of learning conversations rather than I'm using this game and this is how it's going, here are the technical problems. They're all important, but to actually have conversations about pedagogy and practice from the start. So generally, I would say in terms of trying to categorise this, and I know the colleagues from the social science will probably have a lot of different terms and lots of discussions about how we might actually, what we might call this, how we might frame it as methodologically, but actually we're dealing with an intervention project. So kind of cause and effect, pre-test, post-test alone would not really tell us anything. And certainly wouldn't tell us the things that other teachers might need to know. So I think it's probably better if we start to frame the research project with the students and the teachers as action research projects, professional development projects. How are they going to learn from what they've done, and how are they going to relate to other people? Now, of course, to start with, we still need to do the baseline. We still need to get a starting point to understand all that contextual interaction, all those changes that happen along the way. So we need to do a baseline around kind of the context of the school and the students, and then we also have to do stuff about students and teachers' prior experience, knowledge, how their perception towards technology generally and games might be. So we get that as background information from the start, and we'll probably develop some sort of survey to do that, and it'll be in a way quick and dirty because it will be giving us information to then think about what do we explore next, what are the questions we need to ask. We will, through the project, we will be giving teachers stimulus materials. For instance, we will be giving them some of the literature about the pros and cons of using games in the classroom, what the guidance is, some of the theoretical things, some of the case studies of how people have used it before. And those are all critical points for us to investigate. What happens to their thinking around using games after that stimulus? So there's some points we have to pick up on. We need to develop the tools to do that, so some form of logging, some form of diary if you want, ways of getting them to actually reflect on that. But also in terms of giving them some frames of reference to start filling those logs in. We don't want it to be too onerous, and we don't want it to be too descriptive. As the research tells you, if it is, they take their ownership and they find out back. So we have to kind of balance our data collection tools with the practicalities of filling them in. And also we probably want to get some of the students there to start filling in their thoughts as well. And then when we have the visits, I think this is a really important point, because we need to probably in those visits and the exchanges between the schools actually start to do some innovation workshops. So there is a tendency, if you see a new technology, to copy how it's been used elsewhere. What we need to do is probably open their minds, create a million scenarios to start with, so they can have those learning conversations, and then start to discuss as a community how they might shape their own individual projects. And again, this is a flashpoint for data collection and also more interrogation of what might happen. As you move to a sort of second phase, you're talking about setting up the project as a CPD project or an action research project. So this will mean the teachers probably thinking about their own question or questions. They're particularly seeing it as a research project for themselves, not just for us. Because this will allow them to start to think about the stuff they need to tell other people, not just in their own school, across India, globally. And there is an aim with the project to deliver teaching materials that will inspire others and help others use games in the classroom better. Again, we'll probably have different sort of tools to help them think about some of the key things that we need to explore. So they could be anything from logistics, opportunities, barriers, also opportunities. They could be about how do you apply it to the subject lesson or skills lesson. And there are also theoretical concepts about how the technology might be mediated, for example. How different capitals within that context, that cluster, might be exchanged. How the knowledge is exchanged. How the game gets refracted or changed depending on the pedagogical framework. So all those theoretical constructs that we want to start introducing, but we need to do it steadily and we need to do it clearly in a way that all the teachers will understand. We then have a process of a fieldwork, and this is probably the most important area where we need to actually go and observe what's happening. It's easy for somebody to tell us as researchers on a log what they're doing, and often doesn't actually resemble the practice. You need that kind of validity check. You need to see in action. You need to be able to sort of sense the culture of the school, the dynamism of the lesson, what's happening. Really need to get and understand that cultural element. But also, in terms of from what we've gained before, begin to ask more specific questions. And we'll need to do that through actually interviewing the teachers, interviewing the students, interviewing the project partners, maybe other key stakeholders in that area. So kind of layering different sort of methods to actually create a much more detailed picture. But also one that is the picture that is kind of clearly linked to certain key sort of theoretical and key learning issues. Just to finish off, obviously we'll be trying to collect your thoughts, your ideas, your input throughout the project, particularly at this stage. And when we start to develop more specifics around that methodology, we'll kind of run it past you, we'll share it with you. Also in terms of some of the theoretical elements that we want to kind of look at as well. We'll start to share that with you at a later date as well. So I know that was a huge run through of a lot of things, but I just wanted to try and give you a bit of the flavour about the research area, the context in which it's happening, and why some of the general research findings are informing our methodology. So back over to you, Valda. Thank you.